Welcome, familia. This is Josue Collazo, and you're watching and listening to the Found in Translation Post-Democratic Primary Debate Edition. This is Josue Collazo. Thank you so much for joining Found in Translation. Found in Translation is the talk show and podcast that stacks truth on politics and today's hottest issues. You know, we're here after the debates. Who needs Axelrod, Carville? Who needs those characters when you got the law firm of Collazo and Garcia? Of course, I'm here to talk about this very pivotal debate leading up to the Iowa Caucus. My co-host and producer, Elbert Garcia. Elbert.
Ray, man. How's it going, man? How's it going? Great to have you here.
Well,
man.
you know, I'm in a feisty mood because I am dressed like and I kind of have the vibe tonight. I'm channeling like as if I'm the owner of a like minor league MMA league, you know, maybe like, you know, lucha fight or something like, you know, like that's my lucha brawl, you know. So I'm ready to roll up my sleeves here, brother, because did the gloves come off? Did they get bare knuckle? One of the things I want to talk about today, kind of getting by sports, is I think it's important for us to see who wants it the most. Because we're getting down to the nitty gritty. Yeah. So we'll get into that. I have my opinions. But Elbert Garcia, how are you this evening, brother?
I'm good. I mean, you know, I'm talking to you from our nation's capital over here in Washington D.C. And you know, it's all, you know, the primaries feel a little different when you move up north and into closer to the centers of power. So feeling good and thinking that 2020 has started with a real focus on what's important, right? Now, you know, we've got these things going on in other parts of the country, Puerto Rico and other stuff. But at the end of the day, this debate is
in Puerto Rico, LB? I didn't hear that in the debate, brother. That's why you got to watch Found in Translation.
See, exactly, right? We'll talk about really what the real focus of the debate was, right? Especially when let's just say that this debate was maybe had a little more in common with mayonnaise than it used to be before.
Are you referring to the fact that although it was at Drake University, Drizzy, the Drizzy, Drizzy fan culture wasn't really given a lot of love? And you're absolutely right, LB, because the bottom line is not only sort of this Iowa focus. I think you're very right that it really this debate. How you evaluate the debate is really the lens and what you were looking for. And that's kind of my big picture takeaway. And I want to thank people watching and listening to Found in Translation, either as a live Facebook Live show on Twitter, Periscope, YouTube, or as a podcast for our Ride or Dies, or as a radio program at WPPM 106.5 in Philadelphia, hashtag People Powered Media. And I think that really is kind of where I want to begin, because the how you evaluate this last debate before the Iowa Caucus, which will be on February 3rd, really depends on what you were looking for in your perspective. Were you looking for substance? Were you looking for sort of detailed plans around some of the critical issues impacting our country and maybe one or two pet issues that you're particularly concerned about? Were you looking for inspiration? Were you looking for a candidate that would inspire you and you believe would inspire this country and build the kind of coalition that's needed to defeat this not only this horrible president, but this sort of cult of personality that's been built around him, which doesn't care about our Constitution, care about democracy, care about truth, care about people that look like me and LB and our families? Or were you looking for the hunger? And that's what I want to go back to today in my comments when I want to hear after I hear from LB, because on some level, when it gets down to a top four and kind of a couple of BC level contenders sort of not too far away, statistically speaking, in reality, you want to see who wants it the most.
Definitely.
And I think that's one of the things that I feel like I have a few people that I identified that way. And I think at this stage, I think people want to see that. So LB, what's your big takeaways from today?
Yeah, my big takeaway tonight definitely I think the focus in many ways was about what was these Iowa voters, and in some ways, you know, how do you talk to the movable middle, right? And the movable, perhaps a little more white middle, right? That right? And I say, well, you know, I say perhaps because I think the question is, in terms of the white voter in the Democratic Party, is you know, to what end, right? Because if you're pivoting towards white voters and you're doing it in a very public way, then how does that actually energize the rest of the base of the party, right? And so I think that's why
it doesn't. It doesn't. I think.
Right?
And the question is, well, maybe a Democratic primary. I think it's more. The reality is, to me, in an Iowa caucus, and I think the polling is bearing this out. I think it's really more about the undecided voter, which you can argue where they're at in the ideological spectrum. Maybe they are more moderate. They probably are. But that really seemed to be who people were trying to gas, because while the top tier is pretty equal, statistically speaking, they're all pretty neck and neck there in Iowa's, from all the recent polling, even though some are, inching up, and we'll talk about that. There's still over a third of the electorate that's saying they still don't know, and we only got 3 weeks. So the question is, LB, what makes an impact after today on that swing voter, however you want to define it, that you're talking about specifically in Iowa?
Yeah, I mean, and I think, and when it came to that, I think that there were some really kind of poignant questions that kind of came about, and I think that at the end of the day, you saw a lot of thoughtful answers, attempting to be a lot of thoughtful discussion. But it also, I think some candidates did make a name for themselves, especially with those voters in Iowa. And I think what's important to remember that Iowa, because it's a caucus state, it really is like, the power. I think nowadays you might think about it as virality, right? But a lot of times people may go into those caucuses thinking one way, and they start to listen to other people talk and move, and that has an effect, right? And so I think part of what the candidates wanted to do was to give, voters a couple of bullet points, a couple of talking points, so that when they go into those caucuses, they've got something that they could actually latch on. But Ray, I'm curious in terms of, when you were talking about those top tier candidates, even today there was a question was like, is there a brewing kind of rivalry between, especially on the left, pop-up aggressive Bernie Sanders and mom aggressive Elizabeth Warren? I mean, what did you think? What did you think about, especially as it, in terms of this Warren Sanders issue, especially around the question around the presidency, and whether a woman could be president?
So many people, the punditry class, went into this debate wondering if sort of what was going to take center stage and dominate the discussion was going to be this sort of emerging, sort of late in the game tiffs between Senator Sanders and Warren, which have culminated in essentially this accusation by Senator Warren's camp that Senator Sanders, in a private one-on-one meeting before these campaigns started, and they sort of agreed in this meeting they were going to play nice with each other generally, he said that a woman could not be elected president. Now, I don't think most people believe that, that he said that directly or intended to say that. Probably the truth is somewhere in the middle, in terms of making a flip comment or making maybe allusions to it being more difficult for women. But the bottom line is, for me, I think people have their opinions on how they handled it. I don't think that drama is going to be the biggest takeaway out of this race, out of tonight. To me, and we can get right into it, I think the biggest takeaway from their perspective is I think both of them generally look strong, looked hungrier than Biden. Let me just say it straight up. And I think in particular, not to compare them necessarily one to another, and generally speaking, I think this might have been Sanders' finest moment from a debate perspective in a sense, because while I think you still can take sort of, debate points away from him technically on some of the pay-fors questions, and depending how you look at the situation with Warren Sanders, that dynamic or that accusation about that conversation. But I think in terms of who looked strong and confident and hungry for this, I think several of them did well, including Warren. But I think Sanders really stuck out to me. I was really impressed by the fire and the confidence. And in contrast, not that I think Biden did bad, because I don't think he really did bad. And I think he was pretty strong on the substance. And I think it's even on some, like healthcare and some other issues, his more moderate stance, I think, had some compelling arguments. But where was the inspiration? And where was the fire? And in that, regardless of where I think he may have scored on the substantive side, I think Sanders, for me, scored very high. And as we know from this current president, and even, let's keep it real, to some degree from the previous president, how much do people really, at the end of the day, make that decision based on nuance and policy? Not as much as we would like to believe.
Yeah,
So
no, I agree.
I think that those are some of the takeaways. Do you think the Warren Sanders tiff or issue? I don't know. To me, I think it's going to go away.
I think it seems forced. I think it seemed like, especially when they were asking the question, that it almost was like, they were looking to try to get some drama. Sometimes people say at CNN, right? But it looked like it was a little bit forced. And I think you're right. I think, one of the things that, Biden, look, and I've criticized Joe Biden on this show plenty of times, right? And his ability to do that, right? I've been tough on him, and I think in that way, I think he was.
Oh, I know.
But
got a lot of love for him, honestly.
Well, and
we got to keep it real. We got to keep it real. And look, when you're the favorite and you're the former VP, and you got a lot more experience than most of these people, we got to hold you to a higher standard.
Well, and the thing is, I think so. What he did great today, I think what Biden did great today, was that I think he again, these are all final cases that you're trying to make. And I think he made a very strong case to Iowa voters, especially those who like him. Hey, stick with me, right? I'm not going to bumble it. I'm not going to fumble it. Like, I'm really good at this, right? And so I think he made the case in that way, right? But I think when you then compare him, so for his own game, I think this is probably one of his better performances, right? I might say his best performance, right, so far. But again, comparing it to that of the other folks, right? I think you're right that Bernie, and I think Elizabeth Warren, I think both Bernie and Elizabeth Warren, had this point response where they also didn't take themselves too seriously, right? And so I think they were able to joke, they were able to and even get into some kind of a certain amount of levity there, right? On what's a very serious situation in terms of, this is what you're really giving to folks. And so I think they showed them. But I think today was also just an example of really, again, I think we've said it in other cases, there's a really good bench here in terms of for governing, right? Tom Steyer made a really good case that regardless of whether or not he should be the head of the head of the ticket, that he does not just know about climate, but he's got a good sound head on his shoulders, right? And for someone who's a billionaire, doesn't necessarily fit the stereotype of the billionaire that you would be.
Comes off like a real person. There's no question about it. And one of the things that's come up in the last few weeks, and starting in the Christmas holidays, is that there have been the person that has. There's two people that people have asked me the most about that they're starting to get to know. One is Yang, who is still in the race, unlike Senator Booker, and hopefully we'll get to a moment to talk about Booker at the end of the show. Andrew Yang, and people have asked me about Steyer, and I was actually getting texts during the debate tonight. So who's the Steyer guy? What do you think about Steyer? Is Steyer for real? He seems okay, So I think Steyer. And one of my responses was, if I had $1 billion, I'd be up there killing it too. But my point is that Steyer did see legit, and to me, he was one of the biggest winners tonight. He's, by the way, polling very well in South Carolina, and obviously, in a cheaper media market, being able to flood the airways with that certainly helps. But I think you're right. So I think my point, one of the ways I want to sum up this, is that if we're agreeing, generally speaking, Sanders looks strong. Someone that's emerging in the polls. By the way, we all said the AOC bump. Didn't we predict this?
We did.
Y'all need to pay attention. And by the way, it's funny how now Warren wants her AOC with Castro. And isn't it interesting how much he's pushing him? I think that's a little it's almost like too much. But the AOC bump is for real. And it's not only revitalized him in the polls, but it's revitalized him from everything I can see, and my sources are telling me, it's revitalized him personally and his confidence. And I think it's showing in how he's building up in the polls, and the result of not only the field work and the investment in organizing months and months and months, not only in Iowa, of course, which is what we were most concerned about now, but in all these communities like in California and other markets where you're starting to see some increased traction in the polls, is that you see, I think generally speaking, we would say Warren had a good night too. Steyer had a good night. I think Klobuchar had a good night.
I think Klobuchar,
Klobuchar had a good night, right?
Yeah, some really good moments. Yeah.
So if you're talking about it being, sort of a very competitive, deep group, that either someone like Bernie and Warren are starting to re-solidify themselves, and some of these other BC people are sort of emerging. And by the way, Bloomberg in the background, he's going to be a factor in this whole conversation because he's going to have the money to do it. Look what Steyer's done with less of a public profile than a Bloomberg over the last few years. Is that my point is Biden, even to some degree Buttigieg, their electability argument, and certainly Biden's inevitability argument get weaker and weaker, regardless of the fact that I think, generally speaking, he's doing better, marginally better debate to debate, but he still has the flubs and still doesn't seem to be as tight as some of the others. So I think it makes it even more wide open. And to me, I think you have to leave that stage, unlike previous days, saying that, Biden was the front runner, a weak front runner. I think you got to say right now, Sanders is the front runner.
Yeah,
who looked like they were the front runner on that stage. I think it was
and he looked like it was the front runner, and I think it also seemed like they were accepting the fact that he was the front runner, right? Whereas
that's
before,
what I'm
I think
about where was the fighting Biden to take back that seat, dog? That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, and I think all the other
did a Marcus Mariota. If my football fans, he's taking that benching a little too well.
Yeah,
Tannehill just took it from him.
Yeah, and I think Bernie hit the points that he needed to make. And I think the real and so I think someone like Steyer, for example, in the Battle of the Billionaires, I think in some ways Steyer comes out ahead because people are like, well, at least Steyer's le están dando cara, right? Like he's putting up, like he's actually showing up, right? As opposed to I think Bloomberg's working this angle of like a very mathematical angle and with his money, which I mean makes sense from a certain way, but just from a debate standpoint, if we're going like, well, if I've got to choose to go with which billionaire, well, I'm listening to Steyer. Yes, I can hear your ad, but now I'm actually hearing how you actually talk. And so I think
he comes off like a real human being. And the activist class know he's been around. Look, I mean, I've been full disclosure. He's funded stuff I've done.
He's funded,
there's a lot of people in the activist circles that he has funded. And when you have interacted with him and knows, he doesn't come off like the typical big shot funder. Let me ask you a question, Elby, because I think that to me, the most interesting part of the Sanders Warren can a woman be president conversation actually came. The one that kind of jumped into it in a very interesting way was Klobuchar. And so, and there were times in the night where Klobuchar even sort of sided with Warren on the on women empowerment, but then also tried to draw a contrast with Warren on pragmatism and kind of her ability to do things across the aisle and get things done, kind of thing. So my question to you is, what's your thoughts about? And of course, two guys are talking about this. And if there's any women watching, jump on the screen so we can get your perspective on it. But do you think women voters will come out of that interaction and this conversation now being in the arena? Do you think that's going to impact how they move forward? I mean, because Warren certainly has a sort of a core base of support from women that tend to be highly educated, highly involved, highly engaged in this conversation. Maybe Klobuchar gets a second look, and maybe this is sort of just a general win or opportunity for the women candidates to get a little more attention, considering now there's some of the little diversity left in the mix. Obviously, there's a few exceptions.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah. No, I think, I think what they did was that they really answered, I think they really definitively answered this electability question, right? I think this electability question that's, I think, will be the one of the main, in writing about this election, or at least the run up to this election, that's been the major story, like who's more electable, right? And even whether or not if it's even fair, is this electability question fair, especially when it comes to folks of color and women, right? Candidates, right? And so I think they answered it pretty well, right? I think the point that they made, Bernie's 30-year remark notwithstanding, is that, you had a bunch of men who are up there who've lost also elections, right? And these two women have been very successful in terms of who they've beaten and how they've beaten them, right? And so by any stretch of the imagination, this should at least vault them to be considered there. So, do I think women will kind of come out? Well, I think, from a political standpoint, I think there's a little bit of playing with fool's gold when you're talking about the over relying on the women's vote, right? The truth of the matter is that something like 53% of women voted for Trump, or at least of white women, right, voted for Trump, right? So I think putting all your eggs in in terms of the women's basket as a party or as a strategy, it doesn't necessarily mean that you get the vote that you want, especially I think from the party. But I do think that they answered that question definitively. And I think if you're a woman, I think if you're excited about women's issues, I think, you come away with this saying, at least this debate today saying, eso es mierda, whatever. This women's thing, that issue is dead, either elect or not elect, right? Either you like Klobuchar and you like Warren or you don't, right? But they're not going to win. They're not going to lose because they're women, right? There may be other things that they're going to, that they may not be the best candidate for, but the fact that they're women now, I don't know. I think they answered it pretty. I think they answered pretty definitively, and I think their unity in asking and answering that question really, for me anyway, kind of made that question like that's kind of old news, right? I'm kind of tired of that.
I got two things on this. One is I don't think that debate is over within the Democratic voting electorate, because as you've seen, part of the reason, and we'll get to this at the end of the show, but part of the reason Booker and Harris, and to a lesser degree Castro and some of the other candidates of color has sort of fallen off the wayside, is that our own communities were skeptical that they could win a general election, and skeptical, frankly, of how white voters, particularly in certain swing states, would respond to a candidate of color. Yeah. And so likewise now we have this scenario where you have, even though she's still a top tier candidate and Klobuchar's still hanging in, there is that lingering question: could either a woman candidate, and you've heard it from people, Warren could be like a Hillary because there are white women around the same age. They're not really very similar in any other way. Yeah. Win, or less so, but it's sort of a lingering question around Buttigieg's LGBT status, and to some degree also his age, right? Could those candidates win? And so it's interesting how there was a lot of subtext and actually pretty explicit conversation around electability. And so Buttigieg basically argues, I'm a white Midwestern person that could inspire enough young people and diverse type people, LGBT and others, because of my specific personal story, but I'm a Midwesterner and I could get these Midwest voters. Klobuchar basically makes the same argument, but then let me just finish this point. Yeah. What I want to say is, well, on some level, they all talk about it and claim it, and Biden can speak to a historical connection with the Black community and more diverse communities. My point is that who's been really organizing these communities? And again, not to keep banging the drum for Sanders, but since 2016, when he acknowledged that was his weak point, his blind spot, was engaging minority communities. What has he done for the last 5 years? And so my point is the fruit of the labor and the lesson out of this arguing a theoretical, or is the argument that maybe our community responds to people that won't organize with us and listen to us, whether it's who's involved in the campaign, the policies that are being taken, and to me, most specifically, the organizing that's taking place in their campaign. And you can't argue, because even someone like Biden, who still has technically the most Black and Latino support in the polling, you can't argue he's doing more organizing than Sanders has, not only in this cycle, but the last several years.
No, and I think the thing is, I think there is a temptation, because the media cycle will force it, will be to crown somebody after Iowa and New Hampshire, and certainly, at least in the past, to crown somebody after Iowa, South Carolina, and New Hampshire, right? And there's going to be the temptation there that if Sanders doesn't do as well, or if Biden, beats him there, beats him in Iowa and New Hampshire, that maybe a little bit of that shine goes in. But and we've talked about it before, that for folks of color, yes, it's South Carolina, then it's California, it's Nevada, right? Like it's
Texas,
Texas. It's like those states, right? And the real question will be these folks who Bernie, and to a lesson degree, I think also Elizabeth Warren, I think her team in Florida, for example, she's got a great team in Florida in terms of that, are really in touch with folks of color, in terms of Elizabeth Warren. I mean, like comparable at least to Bernie's squad.
Absolutely.
Organizers.
Yeah, especially that Florida group, I can co-sign on them too.
Yeah, and so the question will be whether or not folks of color will stand their ground, and to echo the words of Julian Castro to say, well, you know what, Iowa and New Hampshire doesn't reflect, where the party's at. They're good starting points and they're good litmus tests to a certain degree, but not until you get to some of these places where more of us are in, should you be trying to crown, a leader or a head.
What is fair? And I do want to ask you about the to me, the lack of conversation around diverse communities. So I'm going to ask that question, Elbert Garcia, in a minute. Again, you're listening and watching the Found in Translation Talk Show, post-Democratic primary debate edition in the wee hours here on the East Coast. We give you what you want. You don't need to watch basic cable, fam. Be like, you know what? I ain't really feeling these people. These people ain't really speaking to my issues. You come here, you talk to the fam here, Ray Collazo and Elbert Garcia and others that you see here on other shows, other episodes. I guess there's two things. One, LB, is that, the reality is that, the momentum and the earned media that you're going to get. And, Iowa and Hampshire, especially Iowa, is going to be a big factor because, frankly, most people don't pay attention until there's some results people can chew on. So how, if and when Biden at least doesn't win Iowa, maybe it's a close second or third, but if he doesn't win Iowa, what can happen in Iowa that could move that block in South Carolina? And then to your point, it as long as a Bernie or a Warren or others people support is, or Bloomberg or Steyer's support is with them in California and Texas, they're going to be viable because that's when, after that election, after that day, 40% of the delegates are going to be divvied up. So it's really going to be not only about and also while Iowa and New Hampshire is happening, people in California and Texas are voting early. So it's not like it's so much, well past. Yeah. A lot of people are going to be voting concurrently or very shortly thereafter. So organizing is going to make a difference, and brand loyalty is going to make a difference. The other thing is, LB, do you think that, I tweeted out after the first 45 minutes of the show or so that I was like, have the words African American or Latino or Latinx even been uttered in this conversation? There was a real, you could tell there was a lack of diversity on stage. Very disappointing because there was a lack of conversation around underserved communities and the core of the Democratic Party. Now, I understand it's Iowa, but don't we have to talk to the whole Democratic electorate, LB? I mean, do you think that's going to turn off? The irony is the only diversity on stage was Tom Perez, the head of the party, who did the opening crowd warm up number. Is that going to turn people off? Because I know it turned me off tonight.
I think it was the elephant in the room, right? I think people wanted to kind of do that, and I think they tried to have their cake and eat it too. They tried to bring up some issues that I think are that didn't get as much play as before. Like I think the question around childcare. I thought that was the focus on childcare was something that I didn't think was as much as was in other previous ones, and so I think they tried to do that. They did speak about rural poverty, and in some ways trying to talk about the poverty issue in that way. But the truth of the matter is that they didn't, right? And they didn't talk about Puerto Rico. In fact, I think you had more discussion around the immigration issue that with the ads that Numbers USA was running on CNN. The anti-immigrant folks who were running ads around E-Verify. So that was a more around conversation around immigration than you actually did on stage, right? And to also in the week that there has been around Puerto Rico, to not get a focus about Puerto Rico, especially, again, talking about climate change, but not talking about Puerto Rico and some of these places. Again, I think, it doesn't bode well as to, it's kind of seen as a semi-tone deafness that you hope doesn't seep through the engagement process for the general election, right? Because if it does, then I think then you do have what you were talking about, Ray, which is you have huge swaths of people kind of getting disinterested, right, and turning off, right, and really feeding themselves into this kind of feeling of I would say is that kind of hopelessness, right? Because I think, and again, I think people talk about inspiration, but there's a real sense, I think, especially among huge swaths of people, not just millennials, but huge swaths of people who they really don't believe that the folks in power, regardless of whether they're Democrats or Republicans, can actually get them to a point where their life will be better, right? Or that their life will be more than what they can imagine, right? And so they can't imagine, maybe they might not be able to imagine a woman running the country because they can't imagine, even paying off their student loans, right? And so it's like, so I think that to me is what's scary about not having these conversations. And I think what used to happen when you had more folks of color on stage, specifically Harris and Booker and Castro, is that you had those points being brought up, those very topical points being brought up, and these folks get to basically, run the show without having to think about those things, And
you're watching Found in Translation with Ray Collazo and Elbert Garcia talking about the debates. I'll take it a step further. I think it was really disheartening because, the Democratic Party talks one game. And look, even Bernie was responsible. Bernie could have brought it up. Warren could have brought it up. Yeah. People that we feel are more diverse friendly could have Biden. Biden put about Puerto Rico. You got all kind of people in the circle who understand Puerto Rico and those issues. Nobody brought it up. I mean, if there was thousands, if not tens of thousands of people that were homeless in South Carolina or Southern California or some other part of the country that were having these multiple, freak, natural disaster thing where there's an earthquake and an earthquake, which I didn't even understand that was a phenomenon, frankly. So if that was happening somewhere and that wasn't the first thing we all said, hey, before we even start this, un saludo, shout out. We with you. We're going to be there with you, And I go back to the fact that and all of us, even people of color, we live with this institutional racism in our society, and we just let it go. We shouldn't let that go. The more I think about it, I'm getting pissed off. How do you start this debate without acknowledging this natural disaster that's happening, and that we should do something for these American citizens? There's children that go to school in Puerto Rico. There's people that are so scared to live in their home. Now, I know that's not the government's fault that's happening. This to me is this is a thing of nature. But it's going on. There's no empathy for it.
Yeah.
There's no empathy for it. I mean, why is David Begnad the only mainstream reporter down there in English language media? I mean, this is ridiculous. So to that point, they're all culpable. There's culpability across the network and all the candidates for not bringing it up in the beginning. So, to that point, we love and respect. We're with you, Puerto Rico, 100%. We're doing everything we can to raise money, and that's going to be the big theme of the show Thursday. Elbert, anything else about this debate? Let me ask you this question, brother. What could happen in the next 3 weeks that can change any of the dynamics? Because one could argue, why was it going to be about the field at this point? What could really happen, right? What could happen next week? What should our people be looking out for that could impact the Iowa caucus and sort of the la última hora here, the first set of early voting states?
Well, I mean, I think before I get into that, I want to give a shout out to some of our folks on YouTube. I think there's a bunch of folks, Owen G, Joshua Moed, folks who are kind of tuning in and kind of having a side chat there. So just want to give a shout out to these folks over at YouTube. Definitely check Rewind for some of the discussion that we talked about before about Warren versus Bernie. I think we've talked about it being, Owen, I think we talked about this Warren versus Bernie thing kind of almost being manufactured, almost kind of seeming like, oh, this is a script and stuff like that. So I don't think it's as big a deal, with people. And I don't think it's as much a big a deal with people on the ground in terms of organizers and things like that. I think, Ray, to your question about, what can change over the next couple of weeks that will make a difference there. I mean, I think this question about electability, I think becomes more, more kind of harped in. I think the other question becomes, if impeachment does move forward, or however it moves forward, because it is moving forward. At some point, there'll be a Senate trial, right? Does the ability of, both Warren and Klobuchar, because they're in the Senate, and even even Biden, right? If there's any more materials or things that come about in relationship to the impeachment, does that change people's mind? I mean, if you're talking about Biden increasingly connected with this impeachment trial, do Iowa voters get a little scared off about him, right? Do they say, well, we don't want that kind of, that kind of attention placed on the Democratic candidate, so maybe he slips a bit, right? And in that case, who picks it up, right? You're going to see money being spent by Steyer and by Bloomberg. Do they come out and somehow do that? But I think, I think, as is the case in most things in terms of politics, I think it's the mistakes that people have that will have a greater effect than necessarily something positive about. Someone, Joe's kind of pretty Teflon. He said some pretty stupid things. But if he says something stupid about, and I don't see him making mistakes with like rural voters or folks in Iowa. But I think, I think that's the question, but ultimately, the media is trying to crown somebody as they've traditionally done in Iowa and New Hampshire. And the real question is, now that there are no folks of color, in the race, will folks of color also, kind of let that happen? I mean, we got to remember, when Obama won in 2008, part of the reason why he entered into South Carolina, I mean, South Carolina was not for Obama. People didn't think people didn't think naturally at the time that he actually stood a chance in South Carolina. I mean, really, Iowa, Iowa and his showing in New Hampshire, which he didn't win, but his showing there, those two places, kind of validated his candidacy and almost validated folks of color wanting, especially Black folks in South Carolina, thinking that, hey, maybe it was okay to believe in this guy, right? And so I think that's some of the thoughts I think going into Iowa.
Yeah, I think you're right. The Senate trial is a wild card because that not only takes the senators off the campaign trail, gives them face time, but they don't get to talk during the Senate trial. So they're on TV, but they're not saying much. So hypothetically, that could help the other people, like especially Buttigieg, I would think, sort of in Iowa physically and in some of the early vote states. The other dynamic is it's not impossible. Joe or Hunter Biden are called to testify. And there's nothing about that helps Biden. Nothing, even though they're not hiding much. But it's still the optics of that are yucky. And it distracts him. And if he doesn't win, if he refuses, it doesn't look good. If he does it, he's, so that's a wild card as well. I think that there's going to be a reckoning because I think the more and more that I don't see the momentum after tonight for Sanders slowing down as my basic analysis.
Yeah.
And what's going to happen is the corporate media / the corporate Democratic establishment / Bloomberg, are going to double down. So they're going to try to pick on Bernie. And depending on that result in Iowa, it's going to be muddled, I think. I think this opens the door for Bloomberg. And we haven't talked a lot about him on the show. He's starting to index in some of those big states because of his humongous buys. I see him on TV constantly in the Philadelphia market, much less out in the Southwest. So, and he's starting to, name recognition alone starting to poll. It remains to be seen how much his record, which is mixed, obviously gun control and environmental issues and some of his track record in this as mayor on healthcare, pretty good, pretty standard Democratic stuff, stylish, stop and frisk, and some of the other patron kind of, stylistic things, not so much. And he certainly doesn't want to tax rich people. So I think that I guess my bottom line is that the attempt to try to tear Bernie down because his momentum is going really strong could provide Bloomberg more of an opening that he has if Biden had been the nominal front runner.
It's going to be interesting too, because I think one of the things that I thought was interesting is, look, between the Numbers USA ads, as well as this press release that I think the Trump administration did against attacking Bernie on his immigration, right? Basically saying that a Bernie presidency would let it, would flood and basically open up the floodgates for like illegal, for quote unquote illegal folks. I think that points to an interesting potential strategy, especially in terms of to those rural voters who are listening to Bernie's economic message, right? I think that's the acknowledgement the Trump camp that, hey, maybe, maybe these folks can actually, pull away some folks in terms of our base, right? And that in some ways they want someone to speak to their economic pain, and they feel like in some ways Trump did, but now Bernie could also, right? And so I think that there's an acknowledgement there, and I wonder whether or not over the next couple of weeks, because the Trump campaign really hasn't focused, right? Like they haven't really focused. And I think part of it is that Democratic voters, they have to get something out of their mind, which is to say, Donald Trump is going to come at whoever is the Democratic nominee.
Oh yeah, he'll make up whatever. It's either a socialist or you're
he's going to be nasty.
Pardon my he's going
to be nasty. He's going to use fake stuff. He's going to use real stuff. He's going to do a bunch of things, right? And so this idea that the electability is poised on someone who is almost Teflon to Donald Trump is just a fallacy, right? I mean, like it's just not.
So then the question is, who's going to excite our folks? And that's where we got to go. And again, we've been saying it for many months, and again, it's not because we have anything against Biden. We love Biden, like everybody else. Uncle Joe, and I have track record with him and his peoples locally, nationally, a long time.
Yeah,
this is starting to bear fruit in those Iowa polls, in my opinion. Is that who's a ride or die for Biden? Who's a ride or die? I know Bernie got ride or dies, and how much does that energy, that field organization, that enthusiasm, how much does that matter? Now, at the end of the day, does our electorate across the board, would the ideal scenario be to have the candidate that left? Probably not. But at the end of the day, that cohort, especially that young cohort of young voters in the Democratic Party, and particularly in the Latino portion of the electorate, which is such a big chunk of our electorate, should be the majority of the voters with full turnout this year, could get their say and get their wish. So that would be a game changer, broadly speaking, in American politics for the young people to get their candidate. That would be incredible.
I think what's interesting is also the real question will be, what I would say is that movable middle candidate, right? That one that perhaps there's a love for Biden in some way, not a ride or die, but certainly like an intellectual like agreement with Biden. Are they satisfied with the vice presidential candidate, first of all, that would
you always
they be
focus on it's very good to go, but you like to focus on VPs and cabinets.
But this is the thing. Would they be? But this is the question.
Nobody worries about that.
Would the voter, right? Like, would the voter like to pull in those folks? Right? Because remember, the VP candidate has always been used to try to, at least last couple of years. Is
this the Stacey Abrams will save Biden with black people thing?
Well, if Biden, but that's
you got to get there first, dog.
Well, no, I'm not talking about Biden.
He's struggling right now.
No. I'm flipping it the other way. I'm saying that if voters are convinced that Bernie's gonna do it, right? Then would they be satisfied with a more middle of the road vice president, right? Because they understand the top of the ticket is progressive and doing that way. We got this question from Vanessa Maria, which I think is a real good thing. Let's say Trump gets impeached. Which of the candidates would be able to beat Pence?
They all beaten Pence. Pence is a horrible general election candidate. He has no personality. He's all that anti-gay stuff. His whole vibe sucks. There's a reason he never ran president himself, because he was always considered like a top tier presidential contender. Because he is a horrible general. He would get smoked.
Yeah,
and excellent question. By the way, Ray Rissa Graber, executive producer of the radio program. She reminded me I got to do some things to get my radio thing back in. I will take care of that tomorrow, Vanessa. But so much respect to the ED, who's helping to lead the Philly Boricuas movement. And we're going to talk about more on Thursday's show. We are collecting here in Philadelphia alone, just one campaign in Philadelphia, 1,500 emergency bags of supplies for young people as they're having to move around and be relocated on the island of Puerto Rico. So there's so many different efforts locally and nationally going on in different parts of the diaspora and, of course, on the island. So we're going to continue to monitor and support those things.
Yeah, and this is a really good point to say.
Vanessa.
And I know that we were talking about politics, but again, I do want to give this shout out in terms of this, this website, in terms of to support the nonprofits on the island of Puerto Rico. You can go to Hispanics in Philanthropy, has a really good list page. You can go and you can check out the thing there. So we flashed it on the screen.
As Nancy Santiago discussed on last week's show. No question about
that.
And
stuff like that.
So LB, before we wrap this up, quick things. One is that I got a sip on my last cup of Puerto Rican coffee for Senator Cory Booker. I spoke about this on my IG video if you did yesterday. actually while I was jumping on the train in
Pouring
New Jersey.
pouring a little water,
Yes,
pouring a little water.
New Jersey
just for him,
Transit. In New Jersey Transit, I was pouring that out. But as I said, I think the underlying thing here, which we talk about sort of amongst the fam, but I think, when your core base, I mean, people like us, LB, that people of color from the Northeast corridor that have engaged him, that generally like him, have some understanding of Newark and some of the challenges he dealt with as an inner city mayor. We're not really riding or die with him. It was going to be hard for him to catch that wave. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. And I just think in general, there is a trust gap that Senator Booker, if he's thinking about his national profile, not so much Jersey, being a senator, has to address. And I think he has to be straight up about addressing it. One is this perception of his relationships previously with the farm industry and taking money from them. Some of the local issues related to his relationship with Facebook, with charter schools, and some of those fracasos and sort of local issues in Newark. And be straight up, a lot of people don't buy his personal life stuff. They just don't buy it. They don't buy his Rosario and the questions that...
Yeah, they feel like he's hiding something. They feel like he's hiding something.
And I'm not saying that to be watching Chero. I'm not saying that because I personally don't think it's anybody's business. And I don't know about his personal life. You know what I mean? I don't know. I'm just being straight up that's why it's found in translation, because I'll be honest with people. But when that's those seeds of doubt and thinking someone's not being straight up with them, or has not been a real progressive with some of those very fair critiques in the past, then when your base ain't with you, that's the thing. And I go back to politics and I ask people all the time. Somebody reached out to me the other day, and I can't wait to talk about it on the show. We can't do it yet. It's going to run for office, city council in one of our major cities, a Latina who is a fantastic person, who is one of the people that, if I had to write down my top 30, 40 people that I respect personally, that person sneaks on that list. No question. But my first question to her was, because I don't know this answer, I don't live there in that community, is what's your political base? And she needs to answer that question. So I don't care how wonderful you are, your resume, you got to have a base. You got to have a base. So anyway, so Booker's he's got to address that.
He's got to address it, but I have to say, and this is where, it go, and this is no shade on Amy Klobuchar, but it's like, I couldn't help but think and look at her and say, wow, how does she continue to be in the race? Because the media doesn't focus on her as much. How does she continue to be in the race?
Because she indexes in the early vote states.
Well,
she indexes in the Iowa.
And that's the thing.
It goes back to that bias.
Right,
if Texas was one of the early vote states, Castro would be in these debates.
Right. And I think that's what it kind of shows, right? And it goes to show, like, and again, it's a future question for future candidates, is that, like, especially in terms of folks of color, is that, like, if you've got to survive Iowa and New Hampshire, but you're starting a campaign 7 or 8 months before those primaries, then really, do you put a Bloomberg? Now this is the thing. If you're a person of color, none of us have
$50 billion. Help.
No, and that's it. I mean, look at Deval Patrick.
Oprah, Jay-Z.
Look at Deval Patrick.
He is still.
He's still technically in the race, right?
Yeah,
but he's not polling or anything like that. Again, please.
Are you pouring out a rosé for Marion Williamson, who formerly left the race this week?
I was thinking about. I was thinking about Corey. Corey and her really kind of get the love.
Forget about all the people, man, with the crystals. I enjoyed her in the debates. She was a great SNL character. Elby, before I let you go, Vanessa, we are going to dedicate an episode to that question. Vanessa Maria Graber has put in the chat, who has the best Puerto Rico policy in your opinions of the candidates? I don't feel at this moment prepared to address that question because we have to dive deeper into that.
Yeah, but definitely for the next show.
Frankly, the answer was Julian Castro.
Right.
That was the answer. So it'll be interesting to see if Elizabeth Warren picks up the mantle of Puerto Rico, because now Julian's like her Latino, like, riding the shoddy with her.
Yeah,
and he was really picking up the mantle, and because of her Northeast ties, Massachusetts,
Puerto Rico.
Honestly, I mean, the Florida piece. I could see the Florida piece that coming into focus with the Florida election. There's no question about that. No doubt. Vanessa, let's put a pin in that. Let's put that in the bicycle rack, as they say, because we do need to address that conversation next week or two on the show. No question about it. LB, I want to shout out really quickly Matt Barreto from Latino Decisions, our pollster, because he put a
Yes.
very intriguing tweet up earlier today. He listed 6 cities in the state of Iowa that have
That's true.
a plurality of Latino voters.
That's true.
And so I want to shout out my favorite town in Iowa, has a third Latino population, Muscatine. Do you know where that is in the state, LB? Do you know what region of the state that is?
I have no idea. I'm just going to take a guess that maybe it's in the Southwest.
It is on the border in a
Okay.
community called a region of Iowa, which actually includes Iowa and Illinois, Quad Cities.
Well, there you go.
And of course, you remember the famous group, the Quad City DJs.
The Quad City DJs. That's
I'm
right.
gonna ride
That's
the
right.
train, get on it. So Muscatine got in the mix. So the Latino electorate will play a role in the
They
Iowa
will.
caucus. People
They
sleep
will.
on that. And then the other thing is, LB, what else is on your mind, brother, before I leave my final remark and let people know who we dedicate this episode to tonight?
Well, I mean, I think ultimately, it's January, it's 2020. It's going to be a long year. I want to really kind of push up this idea that folks really have to find the courage to believe, right? To believe in that things don't have to be how we're seeing them, right? That another world is possible, right? And that because part of what's going on is that and you know what it's like? You know what's like, Ray? It's like when you're playing, when you see these football games or basketball games, you come in after halftime and there's a surge, right? And so there's a surge that's going on and you kind of have to hold firm. And I think part of it is that we have to hold firm against all this bad news, whether it's the earthquakes, whether it's the impeachment, and just to say, you know what? There's some real problems, but we can actually figure this stuff out. And so how are these candidates? How is this government? How is our corporation, right? What are they doing to actually solve this stuff? Because we know it's possible. And if you're not on this tip of trying to figure it out, then you need to get yourself to the curb, right? And I think we have to, that is the biggest challenge, I think, with this electorate. Because when you are living in the times that we're living now, where you are afraid, right? Like that fear in Puerto Rico, like that's real. Like you don't,
the fear
people don't know
of
people
mixed
don't know.
status
Like,
immigrant families.
I mean,
is
there's
real.
so
The
much
fear of Muslim Americans is real. The fear of people that potentially are losing their SNAP benefits. Now there's an attack on SSI benefits and pre-existing conditions, which could go away. I mean, the court case Texas went against us. So
and there are people earning money off of that fear, right? And so like it's in people. There are people's interest that people to continue that fear, right? And so the biggest reason, and in this case it's Democratic, but it's also just in general the biggest stumbling block to making a change in 2020 is people not being able to have the energy to fight against that, right? And so I think part of it is figuring out, like, how do you actually give people a reason to actually believe that stuff? Because once you do, then Trump or Republicans' platforms, they kind of pale in comparison. I mean, it becomes an easy kind of thing. It's like, nah, man, like I need somebody who's going to actually help me, not someone who's going to talk me around.
And this gets us in full circle of this conversation, because what you just talked about was the fight and of having hope. And who in our society, forget the political icons, and we'll get to your question on YouTube Live in a second. Let me just finish this point. I'm not ignoring you, my friends. Is that thinking about who's showing us the guts and the courage in the society, and who's not just saying, oh, he's going to win again, nothing we can do about it. The Sunrise Movement, the Parkland Kids, our friend in Scandinavia who just won Time Person of the Year, Miss Thornburg. Who are the young political leadership of this country stepping up? Who's showing us the courage? Now, you may not agree with all their opinions on their issues. Those dreamers, who are standing up truth to power. They're showing us there's a lot of hope. There's a whole lot of hope. And I go back to, the fact that, this organizing makes a big difference. What is the standard line in healthcare politics nowadays from both sides of the aisle. Well, we could disagree, we're on everything else. Pre-existing conditions. It was only 11 years ago you were screwed with pre-existing. That was not a given in our U.S. political conversation. It took the courage of organizing and our, Vanessa. Organizing, it makes a difference. So there's all kind of hope. Well, look how we've moved this debate in so many issues in this country. We're talking about climate change. 5-6 years ago, you were laughed at talking about that concept. And so look at how mainstream it is. Think about how we've mainstreamed and moved forward a relatively short period of time on LGBT issues in a lot of ways, and have a major candidate that's LGBT. And it's not, to me, I don't really think at the end of the day it's really that big a deal in the primary or in the general potentially. So there's a question, and it warrants a much bigger conversation. That ONG on YouTube Live question was, what do you think about Trump expanding executive powers? I'll go beyond that. I've been concerned for the last 3 or 4 presidents that we have allowed our presidents to have much more expansive executive powers. So I think it's incumbent on the next Congress, Senate and Congress, to chill that out. There's some legislation that isn't going anywhere in the Senate, but really calls on that, whether it relates to just in general, particularly these foreign interventions. So to answer your question, Owen, I'm against it, but let's keep it real. It predates Trump.
Right.
This has been a growing trend. This is really since 9/11.
Right. And you could even go back. Congress, yeah. I mean, you could even go back there. I mean, I think the two things that I would point out in terms about the executive power there, right? And each president has creeped more and more executive power, but they've done that because Congress has let them do that, right? And Congress has basically decided to step to the side
because they don't want to take tough votes on. They don't want to take tough votes on wars,
right?
Because if you vote for it, you wasted somebody's money. If you don't vote for it, you look like a punk. So it's tough politics. War politics is tough for a lot of people.
And give the president
but it's your
credit.
job.
Give the president the credit to say that he doesn't give a fuck, right? He doesn't have an F, right? In terms of like saying he's going to wield power and then he's going to task people.
So now we're going to cut off the last 3 minutes of the show on the WPPM version. Thank you.
Oh yeah, that's right. Sorry about that.
Thank you, Elbert.
I am sorry about that.
Brother. I'm going to wrap this up, brother, because as we wrap up this is your Found Translation. We appreciate people watching the show, listening, of course, both live and on demand as a podcast or on YouTube video. We want to dedicate this episode of Found Translation to someone that was a dear family member of ours, Doña Evangelista Martinez, who, and I think it's very appropriate that we dedicate this show to her because she very much embodied in her life and continues to embody what this show's about, which is about honoring the people that make this country, make this world what it is, always made it great. A strong woman based in her faith, a strong woman, Latina, a strong immigrant woman that had raised and built an incredible family, including people that are family with us, and a woman that, even more importantly, never was silenced. And that woman's voice will never be silenced. And not only in the continued, her voice will always live in all of us. And her voice lives on the legacy of the wonderful, very special Martinez family, which is family to us. So, Dios lo bendiga, descanse en paz. Doña Evangelista Martinez, the show is dedicated to you. To ONG's question, we are live typically every Thursday at 8 o'clock Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. So we'll be on this Thursday at 8 o'clock talking about other issues. We did a special debate show. So Owen and Joshua, some of our new friends, on YouTube Live. Great to see some interaction there. Feel free to join us on Thursday. LB, anything else you wanted to share on this special post-debate edition? Any final shout-outs or comments?
No. I just think props to our folks at YouTube, ONG, Jason, for getting involved in the conversation. We definitely appreciate in terms of you adding your comments and continuing to do that. And looking just forward to people being active, right? And people being hopeful, and people really trying to make this world different, because there's a lot of ugliness in the world. And just because the ugliness is there doesn't mean that we have to turn ugly, right? And so I think, kind of keeping that in people's minds,
That's right. And we look forward to the interaction. Thank you again for joining Found in Translation, Post-Democratic Primary Debate Edition, leading up to the Iowa Caucus. I can smell the corn from here, Albie. I mean, I could smell those cornfields. I mean, we need to get out there, and much respect to our folks out in Iowa and all of our friends around the country working on these campaigns, regardless of where you're at. We really appreciate your supporting our democracy. Much respect to our folks raising money, raising awareness, and helping our friends and family on the island of Puerto Rico and doing good work around the country. Appreciate you, brother. We'll see you all Thursday night on Found and Translation.